The night of the fire, Nora Vane had been 7 years old and barefoot on the cobblestones, watching everything her family had ever owned turn orange and then black. She had not watched the man standing at the edge of the crowd. She had not seen his face, only a dark coat, only the particular stillness of someone who was not afraid, which had struck her even then as strange. She had seen his wrist where the coat fell back, the lantern's light catching the skin. A stain like a crescent moon, reddish and irregular, pressed high above the pulse. She had not thought of it again for 19 years. The laundry house behind Mercer Street occupied the ground floor of a building that had once been a warehouse, and it smelled of lye and hot water from the moment the doors were unlocked at 5 in the morning until the fire was banked at 8 at night. Nora Vane had worked there for 3 years, and before that she had worked in a draper's shop on the Strand, and before that she had done mending for a woman on Cheapside who paid half of what she promised. She had done these things because her father had died when she was 12, and because the fire had taken everything that might have given her another kind of life, and because the world was not in the habit of offering women in her position a third arrangement. She was 26 years old. She was thin from sensible economy rather than suffering, with hands that had gone rough earlier than they ought to have, and a face that had been called handsome by people who meant it, and pretty by people who did not. She wore her dark hair pinned close at the back of her neck, and she owned 2 gowns, both of them clean, and she was content in the particular way of someone who has decided that contentment is a form of dignity rather than defeat. The other women at the laundry called her too quiet and too proud, which was fair. She did not correct them. It was on a Thursday in October that the Earl of Cavenden came in. He did not come himself, of course. His steward came, a thin man in a brown coat who carried a list of the household's winter linens and who spoke to the proprietress, Mrs. Osgood, with the particular authority of a man relaying instructions from a higher register. Nora was sorting collars at the far end of the room and did not pay much attention until Mrs. Osgood called her over and said, "His lordship will be sending his man Friday, and I want you to handle the account personally, Nora, because I cannot trust Bet to count correctly when there are more than 6 items." Nora said she would, and went back to the collars. The Earl's man came Friday, and on the following Tuesday, the Earl of Cavenden came himself. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, which she would not have recognized, but the quality of the room's silence when a person of rank entered it. The other women did not stop working. They simply became more carefully invisible, the way animals in a field do when something large and certain moves through it. Nora was at the flat stone rinsing a length of damask, and she turned to look because she had never learned not to look when something required her attention. He was 34. She calculated it later and knew she was right. He was tall and strongly built, with a jaw that looked as though it had been set against some private opposition and forgotten to relax. His hair was dark brown, close-cropped, and his eyes were gray in the flat October light from the high windows, though she would later determine they were in fact a particular shade closer to the color of old pewter, neither blue nor gray, but something between them. He had the stillness of a man who had long since ceased to require anyone's approval, and had not missed it. He was looking for his steward's ledger, which had been sent with the linens and misplaced. Mrs. Osgood called across the room, "Nora, you had the Cavenden parcel." And Nora dried her hands on her apron and walked toward the far shelf where the incoming items were logged, and she found the ledger, and she turned to bring it to him. She saw his wrist. He had pushed back his coat to look at his pocket watch, and the cuff of his shirt had shifted with it. And there, above the pulse on the inside of his left wrist, was a mark the size and shape of a crescent moon, reddish and slightly raised, precisely as she had seen it by lantern light on an October night 19 years ago. She stopped walking. The room continued around her. Bet was turning a sheet through the mangle. Mrs. Osgood was speaking to the steward about the linen count. Someone's shoe scraped the stone floor. The Earl of Cavenden took his ledger from her hand, and she did not remember extending it. And he said, "Thank you." And she said, "My lord," which was correct. And he looked at her for exactly 1 moment longer than the transaction required. And she looked back, and neither of them moved. And then he put the ledger under his arm and turned and left. If you were to ask Nora Vane what she felt in that moment, she would have told you she felt nothing at all. This would have been a lie. The truth was that she felt the 19 years of her life since the fire compressing into a single cold point at the center of her chest, and that the point was neither anger nor grief, but something that had not yet decided which it was. She went back to the damask. She rinsed it. She folded it and set it on the drying board. She did not say anything to Mrs. Osgood. If you are wondering whether she was certain, she was. There are things a child sees in the particular clarity of disaster that adult memory does not soften or revise. She had seen that mark by lantern light while her home burned, and she had filed it away with the same wordless precision with which she had filed everything else that night. The crack of the timbers, the smell of charred cloth, the heat against her face, the way her father had held her shoulder and turned her away. She had not filed it as significant. She had filed it as real. What she did not know was how to hold the realness of it now that it had become significant. The fire had taken the house on Marvel Court, where her father kept his workshop. He had been a watchmaker, careful and patient, with delicate tools he kept wrapped in chamois leather. The fire had taken the tools and the clocks in progress, and the small income the workshop represented, and it had taken the lease, and it had taken the life they had been living there, and within 2 years it had taken her father himself, worn down by the rebuilding that never quite finished. The cause of the fire had never been determined. The landlord had spoken to someone at the parish, who had spoken to someone at the magistrate's office, and the conclusion was that it had been an accident, the kind of fire that started in a kitchen or a hearth and grew beyond its station. Nora's father had accepted this. He had not had the resources to argue otherwise. Nora at 7 had not understood that there was an argument to be made. She understood it now. The question was what understanding meant and what she was prepared to do with it. She thought about this for 2 days. She was not by nature a person who rushed decisions. She was, by nature, a person who assessed the available facts with a certain cold patience and then acted from them, which was both a strength and the source of most of her loneliness. On Saturday, she went to the parish records office and asked whether there was any documentation of the fire on Marvel Court in the winter of 1806. The clerk, a young man with ink on his fingers, looked at her with the particular blankness of someone who did not understand why a woman in a laundress's apron was asking him for historical records. She explained that her family had lived there. He softened, fractionally, and went to look. The record existed. The fire had begun, according to the notation, in the early evening of the 5th of November, in the property adjacent to the workshop, a storage house belonging to the Cavenden estate. The matter had been settled privately. There was a signature at the bottom of the document, and though Nora could not identify the hand, the seal pressed into the wax beside it was a coronet above the letter C. She stood in the records office for a long time. The young clerk asked if she needed assistance. She said no. She thanked him. She left. She was not a person given to dramatic gestures, and she was not a person who believed that the world owed her recompense. She understood the machinery of her position well enough to know that a laundress who presented herself at the gates of an earldom claiming historical responsibility for a fire would be turned away so cleanly and completely that the turning itself would leave no mark. She also understood that she had knowledge that someone, somewhere, had worked to bury. Whether the Earl of Cavenden knew, whether the sealed document was his action or his father's, whether the crescent-marked wrist on the man at the edge of the crowd had belonged to a perpetrator or only a witness. These were separate questions. She had to know which. She told no one this. She had no one to tell. If the women at the laundry had known what Nora Vane was considering, they would have called her 10 kinds of fool, and they would not have been entirely wrong. The Cavenden household was among the most prominent in the county. The Earl himself was a known figure, not beloved in the way of charming men, but respected in the way of men who do what they say and do not make unnecessary noise about it. He sat on 3 committees, managed his estate with a precision the tenants appreciated even when it was inconvenient, and had been widowed 4 years ago in a manner the county had treated with the delicacy owed to genuine grief. He was not a man to cross lightly. Nora was not crossing him lightly. She was crossing him with both hands open, prepared to be wrong, prepared to be turned away, unprepared to let the information sit inside her without doing something with it. When the next consignment of Cavenden linens arrived on the following Tuesday, she made sure she was the one who met the steward's man at the door. She made sure she was the one who wrote the ticket. And when the ticket was written, she said, quietly, and without any particular emphasis, "Would it be possible for me to speak with his lordship, when he next calls in person, about a private matter concerning the household?" The man looked at her. She held his look. He said he would pass the word along. She thanked him and went back inside. 3 days later, a sealed note arrived for her at the laundry house. It bore no signature. It gave a time and a location, a side gate of the estate house on Mercer Place, and a single instruction: come alone. If this gave her pause, she did not permit it to show. She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket, and did not take it out again until she was at home, where she sat with it on the table and looked at it in the lamplight, and thought carefully about what it meant that he had responded at all. She went. The side gate opened onto a service passage, and the service passage opened onto a small courtyard that she would later learn was used for the estate's household accounts. A footman led her without speaking to a study on the first floor, and he knocked, and a voice said, "Come in." And the footman stood back, and she entered. The Earl of Cavenden was standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered. He was wearing a dark coat, and his cuffs were buttoned, and his expression was the same as it had been in the laundry house, composed and gray and attending. He said, "You wish to speak with me?" She said, "Yes." She stood in the center of the room, and she did not drop her eyes, because she had learned early that dropping her eyes was a form of consent she did not always owe. She said, "I want to ask you something, my lord, and I would like to ask it plainly, because I do not have a clever way of approaching it." He said nothing, which was a kind of permission. She said, "Were you present at a fire on Marvel Court in November of 1806? The stillness in him changed. It did not break, but it altered, the way ice alters when the temperature drops another degree. His eyes moved from her face to a point slightly to her left, and then back to her face. He said after a moment, "How old are you?" She said, 26. He said, "You would have been 7. She said, "I was 7. I was standing on the cobblestones. I saw a man at the edge of the crowd who was not afraid, and I saw a mark on his wrist." She paused. "I work with linens. I recognize things I have seen before." He was quiet for a long time. She did not fill the silence. This was one of her more useful qualities. He said, finally, "My lord." She said, "I beg your pardon." He said, "You are addressing an earl." "My lord." She said, "Yes?" "My lord." He moved from the window to the desk. He did not sit. He stood behind it. And she understood that the desk was a boundary he was drawing, and she understood why. He said, "Who else knows you are here?" She said, "No one." He said, "Who else knows what you believe you saw?" She said, "No one, my lord." He said, "What is it you want?" This was the question she had been asking herself for 10 days, and she had prepared for it. And the preparation had produced not a demand, but a single honest answer. She said, "I want to know whether the fire was an accident." He looked at her for a very long time. She was aware of the fire burning behind her in the grate, and the sound of the street through the window, and the particular way the light in the room was arranging itself around him, as if it had learned his habits. He said, "No, it was not." The room did not change. The fire continued. She stood in the center of it and felt the 19 years settle and resettled against this single syllable, the way sediment falls when the water is disturbed. She said, "Was it yours?" He said, "It was my father's." She waited. He said, "The storage house was not insured. The estate was in debt. The fire served several purposes." He said this the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed saying without an audience, flatly and without ornament, the words scrubbed of feeling by long practice. He said, "My father died 6 years ago. I became aware of the full circumstances of the fire only 4 years ago, when I was settling his accounts. I have not known what to do with the knowledge." He paused. "I was 17 in 1806. I was at the edge of the crowd because I had been told there was a fire and I had walked over to see it. I did not know, at the time, what had been done or why." She said, "Do you believe that?" He said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "Do you believe yourself?" A very slight alteration crossed his face. Not anger. Something closer to surprise, the look of a man who has not been challenged in exactly that register before. He said, "I do not know." "That is the honest answer." She said, "It is a better answer than the one I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "Denial, my lord." He said, "I have been denying this for 4 years. I am tired of it." She had not prepared for this. She had prepared for cold authority, for dismissal, for the particular contempt of the privileged, for the inconvenient witness. She had not prepared for a man who was tired. She said nothing. He said, "Your father. Was he the watchmaker?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I read the accounts when I went through my father's papers. There was a name. Vane. I looked into it. I knew that the man had died." She watched his jaw work against something. He said, "I did not know about a daughter." She said, "I did not advertise myself." He looked at her again with that attending quality that she had noticed in the laundry house, the quality of someone who was seeing her rather than the category she occupied. He said, "What would you like to happen now?" She said, "I want the record corrected. The parish document says the fire was an accident. It was not. I want it corrected." He said, "That will be complicated." She said, "I imagine so, my lord." He said, "It will implicate the estate." "My father's name." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you believe this is the right thing?" She said, "I believe my father deserved the truth of why his life went the way it did. I believe that is a small thing and a reasonable one. I am not asking for the estate. I am not asking for compensation. I am asking for a corrected record." He said nothing for a long time. She had not sat. He had not asked her to. He said, "Will you come again on Thursday?" She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, I will have a solicitor present. Someone independent. I will instruct him to look at the parish documents and advise me what correction is possible and what form it ought to take. He paused. I will do this regardless of what you decide to do afterward. You are not required to trust me, she said. I will come on Thursday. She left. She walked the length of Mercer Street without remembering doing it, and by the time she reached the laundry house, she had decided that she did not know what she thought of him, and that this was, perhaps, the most honest position she had occupied in some time. The things she thought about, walking home in the dark, were small and particular. The way he had said, tired. The fact that he had answered her second question at all. The recognition that there was a difference between a man who had done a wrong thing and a man who was the son of a man who had done a wrong thing, and that she had not, until this evening, properly separated the two. She was not certain that this distinction absolved anyone. She was not in the business of absolution. She was, however, in the business of precision, which was perhaps why her father had made her his apprentice before he understood that the world would not permit women to be watchmakers. She thought about this too. On Thursday, she returned. The solicitor was a compact man of 50, named Fellows, who spoke in careful sentences and seemed unsurprised by the situation in the way of someone who had arranged a great many private settlements in his career. He had the parish documents and a copy of a letter she had not seen, a letter from the old Earl to the previous parish clerk, which confirmed the deliberate nature of the fire and requested that the official finding be adjusted in exchange for a donation to the Parish Restoration Fund. The language was careful, and the intent was plain. Nora read the letter twice. She handed it back without speaking. Fellows said the correction could be made, though not publicly in the first instance. He said the option was a formal acknowledgement in the estate's private records, cross-reference to the parish file, with a notation in the county record of the actual cause. He said this was as much as the law permitted, without a formal inquest, which, given the time elapsed, was unlikely to be ordered. He said, if Miss Vane were satisfied with this, it could be done within a fortnight. She said, and the donation. To the parish. Fellows looked at the Earl. The Earl said, there will be a separate arrangement for Miss Vane's circumstances, independent of the record correction. She said, I did not ask for that. He said, I know. She said, I do not want it. He said, I understand. He looked at her with the gray directness she was beginning to catalogue as simply a feature of his face. He said, my father's action cost your family its livelihood, and then its life. The correction of a parish record is the least of what I can do. The rest is a matter I intend to address regardless of your permission. She said, you should not do things that require my permission, and then tell me you intend to do them regardless. He said, that is fair. He said, I will not do it without your agreement. I would like your agreement, however. She said, what are you proposing? He told her. It was a straightforward proposal, legally. There was a property on the edge of the estate, a small house with a workshop attached that had been standing empty for 3 years. There was, in the estate records, a debt owed to the name of Vane that had never been settled. The debt could be discharged in the form of a 20-year lease on the property, at no cost to the tenant, with an accompanying settlement in pounds that would allow for the fitting of the workshop to whatever trade Miss Vane wished to pursue. She sat with this for a long moment. She said, you have done this before. He said, the arrangement, not the reason. She said, other debts. He said, my father left a great many. He said this without self-pity and without drama. He said, I have been settling them since I inherited. Most are financial. Some are of another kind. She said, "How many of the other kind?" He said, "You are the second." She said, "And the first?" He said, "A family in Derbyshire." He paused. "A fire there, too." She looked at him. He looked back. The fire in the grate between them continued its own quiet business, and outside the window October was sharpening into something colder. She said, "Did you think I would be satisfied with the record?" He said, "I thought you deserved more. I thought you would refuse the more." She said, "I am considering it." He said, "I know." She said, "It would change my position considerably." He said, "Yes." She said, "People would talk." He said, "They will say the estate has discharged an old debt," which is accurate. She said, "They will say more than that." He said, "Probably." She said, "It does not concern you." He said, "It concerns me that you would be made uncomfortable by it. Beyond that, no." She left that afternoon without giving him an answer. She told him she would write. He said that was entirely appropriate. The solicitor showed her to the side gate. She walked home in the dark again. And the dark was colder than it had been on Tuesday. And she pulled her coat against it, and thought about the workshop her father had lost, and the tools he had wrapped in chamois leather, and the way he had turned her away from the fire with his hand on her shoulder. And she thought about a 20-year lease and a workshop with a window that let in the morning light. And she thought about a man who had answered her second question when she had not expected him to answer even the first. She had not thought about it in terms of him, precisely. She understood that it was dangerous to think about it in terms of him. She wrote him a letter on Sunday. She said that she would accept the property arrangement, provided the documentation made the estate's legal acknowledgement clear, and provided that the record correction was completed first. She said she was grateful for the care he was taking. She said, and then did not say, a number of other things. She sent the letter on Monday. His reply came Wednesday. It confirmed that the solicitor would have the documentation ready by the following Monday, and that the record correction would be filed on the same day. It said, in a postscript written in a different hand than the formal portion, that he was glad she had agreed, because he had not known what he would do if she had not. She read the postscript 3 times. The following Monday she signed the documents in Fellows's office, with the Earl standing at the window of the same study where she had first told him about the fire, and when Fellows left to file the papers at the county office, she and the Earl were alone in the room, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He said, "How is the laundry house?" She said, "Quiet." She had given notice the previous Thursday. She said, "I have not been back since Thursday." He said, "What will you do with the workshop?" She said, "I have been thinking about that." She paused. "My father taught me some of the work before I was old enough to be told I could not do it. Not the precise assembly, only the principles. I thought perhaps mending in the beginning. Clocks and small mechanisms. There is a trade in it." He said, "I know. There is a clock in the hall that has not run correctly in 2 years." She said, "I could look at it." He said, "After you are settled?" She said, "Yes." He said, "It is not urgent." She said, "No." The room was very quiet. She said, "I owe you a correction." He looked at her. She said, "In this room, the first time, I asked if you believed yourself." That was a discourteous question. He said it was a fair one. She said, "It was both." He said, "I appreciated it." He said this with the same flatness he brought to most of his declarative sentences, but she had been watching him long enough now to understand that the flatness was not absence. It was the opposite. It was the particular voice of a man who means precisely what he says, because he has learned that ornamentation is a way of meaning less. She looked at his left wrist. The cuff was buttoned. She looked back at his face. He said, "What is it?" She said, I was trying to remember what I thought when I saw you in the laundry house. What I thought before I thought anything about the fire. He waited. She said, I thought that you were the kind of man who does not pretend to feel things he does not feel. I thought that was unusual, he said, and after you thought about the fire. She said, I thought the same thing. That is why I was willing to come. Something shifted in his face. It was not the ice alteration she had seen before. It was something more interior, slower, the way a room changes when a door is opened in it, and the season comes in. He said, Nora. She said, yes. He said, I would like, when you are settled in the house, to call on you, if you would permit it. She said, in what capacity, my lord? He said, I have not decided the exact form. I would like to discover it. He said this with a gravity that made it clear he had not said it lightly, that it was not a proposition of a casual or dishonoring kind, that it was in fact the most careful thing he had said to her since she had walked into his study asking about a fire. He said, I am not practiced at this. I want to be honest about that. She said, I noticed. He said, it is not a disadvantage. She said, no, I do not think it is. She left soon after, because fellows returned, and there was more paperwork, and the practicalities of the thing expanded to fill the afternoon the way practicalities do. He walked her to the side gate himself, which was not strictly necessary, and which the footman noted with a particular quality of blankness that she recognized as careful discretion. At the gate, he said, I will have the house ready for you by the 1st of the month. She said, that is very efficient. He said, I have a good steward. She said, I am beginning to think efficiency is a family characteristic. She had not intended this to be funny, and it was not, precisely. But something happened at the corner of his mouth, a compression that was not quite amusement, but was close to it. And she stored the image with the same wordless precision with which she stored other things. She walked home. The 1st of November the house was ready. It was a modest house, stone-built, with 4 rooms and a workshop that occupied the back in its entirety, with 2 large windows that let the morning light in from the east. The walls were freshly whitewashed. The workshop had a workbench of seasoned oak and several shelves, still empty, that waited to be filled. She stood in the workshop the first morning and watched the light move across the empty shelves. She had brought very little. She had not owned much. She had brought her father's tools, the ones that had been replaced over the years, with what she could afford, which were not the originals, but were close to the spirit of them. And she laid them out on the workbench, in the order he had taught her. The smallest to the left, the largest to the right, the delicate ones in the center. She stood back and looked at them. She did not cry. She had done her crying for her father at the proper time, which was to say years ago, in the particular solitude that comes from having no one left who cared that you were crying. She allowed herself, in the quiet of the workshop, to feel the weight of the thing that had been restored. Not the tools, not the house. The permission to do the work she had been trained for before the world decided she could not have it. Her father had told her once, on an afternoon when he was adjusting the escapement of a bracket clock, that the finest thing a watchmaker could do was to make time reliable for someone who needed it. He had meant this practically. She understood it differently now. He came on the 3rd of November. He came alone, which was not quite proper, but the village was small, and she was not, technically, under anyone's chaperonage, and the rules of propriety bent in the countryside in ways they did not permit in town. He stood in the workshop doorway and looked at the tools laid out on the bench, and he said, "They are not your father's. She said, "No. They are the same order." He said, "You remember it." She said, "I remember everything he showed me." He came into the workshop. He looked at the shelves, which were still mostly empty, and the bench, and the windows where the November light was doing its narrow, determined best. He said, "What will you start with?" She said, "I wrote to 3 households in the county about mending work. I expect to hear back from one of them." He said, "I will tell you where to apply to the others, if you like." He said this without any suggestion that he intended to do it for her, only that he had information that might be useful. This was, she was beginning to understand, how he typically offered things, as if he were handing a tool to someone who already knew what to do with it. She said, "Thank you." He said, "The clock in the hall." She said, "When you like." He said, "Not today. Today I came to see how you were settled." She said, "I am very well settled. Thank you." He said, "Good." They stood in the workshop, which was small enough that they were closer than they would have been in the study, and the light from the east windows fell across the workbench and across the side of his face, and she saw the gray of his eyes more clearly here than she had seen it anywhere else, the pewter quality of them, the particular stillness of someone looking at something they are deciding how to speak about. He said, "It is strange, being here." She said, "Strange." He said, "I know what this house cost, not in money. I mean, I know the history of what brought us both to be standing in it." He paused. "It seems wrong to be glad of the outcome when the path to it was what it was." She said, "It seems right to me." He looked at her. She said, "The path was wrong. That is settled, or as settled as it will be. The outcome is not the path." She said this with the precision she brought to other assessments, not quickly, not cheaply. She said, "I would rather be here and know the truth of it than be in the laundry house, and not." He said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to ask whether I may call on you regularly, with the intention of knowing you, and with an honesty that I did not have at the start of this, which is that the intention has something more in it than the settling of a debt." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know." He said, "You are not surprised?" She said, "I notice things." "I notice things." He said, "I know." He said this with the compression at the corner of his mouth again. He said, "It is one of the things I noticed about you." She said, "You may call." He said, "Thank you." He left. He walked back across the estate grounds in the November light, his coat dark against the stone of the boundary wall, and she watched him go from the workshop window, and then she turned back to the bench and picked up the smallest of her tools and held it in her palm the way her father had taught her, to feel the weight of it before beginning. The first household that wrote back about the mending work was a family 3 miles east. The second was the Cavenden estate itself, which sent a formal note the following week, requesting that Miss Vane attend to the hall clock at her earliest convenience, signed by the steward in a hand that was not the Earl's, but accompanied by a single line in a second hand at the bottom of the page, saying, "I have told fellows to note your rates in the estate's regular accounts. You are not, under any circumstances, to do this one for nothing." She set the note on the shelf above the workbench, next to the smallest of her tools. He came every Tuesday after that. He came in the afternoon. And he stayed for an hour, sometimes less, occasionally a little more. And they talked about the work and the estate and the county, and carefully and in no particular order, the accumulated years of their 2 separate lives. She told him about the draper's shop and the mending woman and the 3 years at the laundry house. He told her about his father's debts and the estate as he had found it when he inherited, and about his wife, whose name had been Catherine, who had died of a fever in the 4th year of their marriage, and left behind a daughter named Harriet, who was now 5 years old and lived mostly in the nursery, and was, by the steward's regular account, causing significant disruption to the household's daily routine. Nora said, "What kind of disruption?" He said, "The kind that 5-year-olds cause." He said this without complaint, and with a complicated expression. She had learned to read as love expressed in the particular mode of a man uncertain how to name it. She said, "I would like to meet her." He said, "That is somewhat irregular." She said, "Yes." He said, "She would like you." She said, "You do not know that." He said, "I know she is interested in small mechanisms. She has disassembled 2 of the clocks in the nursery." He paused. "Successfully. I believe she puts them back together in the night and takes them apart again in the morning so that no one grows complacent." Nora laughed. She did not laugh often, and when she did, it was not the performed variety, but the plain startled kind, and he looked at her with a quality she had not seen in his face before, which was something very close to relief, as if he had been waiting a long time for the sound. Harriet came on a Saturday in December, brought by her nurse, and she was a small, determined person with her father's gray eyes and her mother's, apparently, reddish hair. And she walked into the workshop and went directly to the workbench and said, "What are these?" Nora said, "Tools for mending clocks." Harriet said, "I know how to take a clock apart." Nora said, "Can you put it back together?" Harriet looked at her with a gravity that did not belong to a 5-year-old and said, "Sometimes." Nora said, "Then you're at the same stage I was at 7. Harriet said, "My papa says you mended the hall clock." Nora said yes. Harriet said, "It has not worked correctly for 2 years." Nora said it does now. Harriet appeared to weigh this. She said, "Could you teach me?" Nora said, "In time." He was standing in the doorway watching this, and when she glanced at him, he looked away, which was the first time she had seen him look away from anything. And she understood that he was doing it, because the alternative was something he was not yet prepared to show her. She let him. December moved into its narrow, cold self. The work at the bench accumulated. The Cavenden estate sent 3 more clocks, and the family to the east sent a mantelpiece piece with a broken lever, and a gentleman in the village brought in a pocket watch whose mainspring had cracked in the cold. She fixed them one at a time, in order, in the morning light from the east windows. On Christmas Eve, he came in the afternoon, and brought Harriet, who was carrying a paper folded into an uncertain shape, and who presented it to Nora with both hands, saying it was a clock she had drawn. The clock in the drawing had 6 hands, which Harriet explained was because she had not yet decided how many was correct. Nora said, "6 seems thorough." Harriet said, "Papa helped with the shading." Nora looked at him. He looked at the workshop wall with the expression of a man who had assisted with a drawing of a 6-handed clock, and was not sorry about it. She set the drawing on the shelf above the workbench, next to the note about the estate rates, and the smallest of her tools. He walked Harriet back to the nurse and returned. The workshop was quiet. Outside the window, the December light was doing the thing it does on clear winter afternoons, going gold and then going fast. He stood in the center of the room. He said, "I have been thinking about what to ask you, and I cannot find the careful way to say it, so I'm going to say it plainly." She set down the tool she was holding. He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I want to say the reasons clearly, because I think you deserve to hear them clearly, and not as an arrangement." He said, "I have found, over these months, that Tuesdays are the part of the week that matters. I have found that the work I do every other day is more legible to me because of the hour I spend here. I have found that my daughter comes home from this house, and is quiet in a way she is not otherwise quiet, which is a kind of contentment I have not known how to give her. He paused. These are not romantic declarations in the usual mode. I am aware of that. She said, They are not. He said, I also find that when I am here, I am aware of you in a way that has nothing to do with the debt, or the record, or the history of any of it. That I am aware of where you are in the room without looking. That when you laugh, I find I had been waiting for it without knowing. He said this last quietly and without ornamentation, and she knew it was true, because he did not say things he did not mean. She said, Those are more romantic. He said, I hope so. She looked at him. He was standing in her workshop, in the December light, with his cuffs buttoned and his expression composed in the way that was not coldness, but care. And she thought about the night of the fire, and the 19 years, and the crescent mark she had seen and filed away with the precision of a child who did not yet know what precision was for. She said, Yes. He said, Yes. She said, Yes, I will marry you. She said it plainly, the way she said things when she meant them entirely. He moved from the center of the room to the bench where she was standing, and he took her hand and held it, and she could feel the warmth of his hold through the work roughness of her own palm, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because neither of them needed to. His left wrist was turned toward her, the cuff shifted where it always shifted when he extended his arm, and there above the pulse was the crescent mark, reddish in the December light. She looked at it and looked at him. That, she said, it was never a wound, was it? It was always just a mark. He said, I was born with it. My father called it an inheritance. She said, he was wrong about what that word means. He said, yes. I have been trying to correct that. She said, you are doing well. He looked at her in the way she had catalogued by then, attending and particular, the gray of his eyes steady in the failing afternoon light. He said, I have had good assistance. Outside the workshop window, the first snow of winter was beginning, a thin, persistent fall that would, by morning, have covered the grounds and the boundary wall and the road between the house and the estate, and the village and the county and the world that the season had arranged itself against them, softly and completely, as if it meant to make everything that had gone before into a single white and quiet and settled thing. She did not look at the snow yet. She kept her eyes on his face, and he kept his on hers, and her hand was warm in his hold, and the 6-handed clock drawing was on the shelf above the workbench, and her father's tools were laid out in order, smallest to the left and largest to the right, and the delicate ones in the center, exactly as she had been taught. That is where the story closes. In the workshop, in the December light, in the warmth of a hand she had not expected to be given. Not in the grand rooms of the estate or the public eye of the county, but here, in the place where the work was done and where time was made reliable for those who needed it. If her father's ghost was anywhere that evening, it was in the workshop, in the tools laid out in order, in the girl who had learned precision from him and kept it all these years, and who had used it, finally, to find her way back to everything the fire had taken, and forward into everything it had not known to take, because it had not known she was there. Thank you for staying until the end. If Nora's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that mattered most.